continuation with the lecture series in the module Pharmaceutics under Pharmaceutical Sciences, and in continuation with the topic of the last lecture, a thorough perception on liquid dosage forms suspensions. In the last lecture, we had touched upon number of factors which are important to consider the stability of a suspension. Whenever we talk about suspension systems, as discussed in the last lecture, we have understood that suspensions are thermodynamically unstable biphasic systems having a solid phase and a liquid phase, generally the solid phase being insoluble in nature. It becomes very important to understand that whenever a suspension stability has to be accounted, its accountability should be with regard to chemical stability and physical stability. As already mentioned, there are various factors to be taken into consideration with respect to stability preview. We have already discussed the factors such as settling or sedimentation rate of suspended particles. We had discussed limitations of Stokes' law as well, sedimentation in flocculated and deflocculated systems. We had spoken about controlled flocculation, effects of particle size on suspension stability. So, in continuation with the remaining factors, it is important to understand the relevance of crystal growth in case of stability establishment. Whenever we talk about the terminology crystal growth, the term itself is self-explanatory, but at the same time it is synonymously referred as Ostwald's ripening. It is nothing but growth of a crystal. So basically, when we talk about crystal growth, we understand it as a process wherein there is aggregation of small size particles in order to produce large size particles. So as the name indicates, there is growth in the particle size. So because of this, it may affect the stability or the aspect of the suspension stability on a long run, because the stability is influenced by particle size. So the crystal growth will have an impact and influence the average particle size. So it is very important that when a formulation of suspension is undertaken, one should give an important consideration to regard with respect to whether the crystal will grow on standing. The remedy to overcome in case such a problem is predicted, the problem can be controlled by use of surfactants or by addition of polymeric colloids, as they may form a coat over the particle and the particle aggregation may be curtailed. So for that reason, the remedy in order to avoid crystal growth is by understanding that one can add a surfactant or a polymeric colloid into the formulation as one of the excipient, thereby avoid the crystal growth. The last factor which is important to understand with respect to stability of suspension is with regard to use of structured vehicles. It has to be understood that structured vehicles are very important because generally they are incorporated to have a better stability. Especially generally the formulation criteria is in preparation of flocculated suspensions. So basically when we talk about use of structured vehicles, these are nothing but they are also referred as suspending agents. So these help in building up the viscosity of the system. So they are also sometimes referred as viscosity imparters. Generally natural or synthetic polymers such as methyl cellulose, carboxymethyl cellulose, sodium carboxymethyl cellulose, acacia or gelatin are incorporated. But the remedy is though use of structured vehicle, but there could be a problem that when the concentration of structured vehicle is more, this may form a problem because the viscosity of the system has to be adequate. If the viscosity is too high, then the suspension stability will be affected. For example, in case it is a deflocculated system, the use of structured vehicle will be helpful initially, but when the particles are getting embedded in the structure of the vehicle, then its redispersion becomes difficult even on shaking. So the cake formation in case of deflocculated suspension will be very hard and its redispersion becomes difficult. In context of flocculated suspension, if we talk about the use of structured vehicle, it is highly advantageous because this will hold the particles in its structured network and thereby prevent settling. But at the same time, too high concentration of such an agent will affect the viscosity of the preparation. So a balance has to be maintained with the structural property of the polymer which is added or with respect to the viscosity of the entire formulation. And at the same time, it is very important that these have to be added in the formulation because they help in reducing the rate of sedimentation. Now, having understood all these 7 criteria which affect the stability, it can be concluded that suspensions, although they are thermodynamically unstable systems, but its physical stability can be enhanced by taking such factors into consideration, and the chemical and biological stability can be enhanced. So the learning outcomes of the module out of a thorough perception on liquid dosage form part 7 and 8, what we have discussed, we have touched upon under biphasic liquid dosage form, definition of suspensions, advantages and disadvantages, classification of suspension dosage form, in general the preparation methodology. Then we have also touched upon types of systems as being flocculated and deflocculated suspensions, and finally we have discussed about what are the stability challenges and what are the remedies to overcome the stability challenges. Now these topics are in sync with the curriculum as prescribed by Pharmacy Council of India for the Bachelor of Pharmacy students. Having completed biphasic systems, solid and liquid type, next we will be starting with a new subdivision of biphasic dosage forms, that is liquid in liquid forms. So just to revise the classification grid, biphasic liquid dosage forms are broadly categorized either into liquid in liquid type or solid in liquid type. Just we have completed suspensions, which is an example of solid in liquid type under oral use, that is suspensions. Today's series will be in continuation with biphasic liquid dosage form, liquid in liquid type, oral use. So we will be taking up the discussion on emulsions. The topic on emulsions will be covered in different phases. The topics which will be covered are, we will be starting with definition of emulsions, the classification of emulsion dosage forms, touch upon what are emulsifying agents. We will also be discussing the various tests used for identification of type of emulsion. We will discuss methods of preparation of emulsion. Also, we will highlight what are the stability challenges with respect to emulsion dosage form, and finally we will also suggest the methods or the remedies to overcome these stability problems. So starting with definition, as already mentioned, one has to remember the exact categorization of emulsion dosage form. So as already mentioned, these are liquid dosage forms biphasic type, and they are heterogeneous because they have 2 phases. So they are heterogeneous systems, biphasic in nature, and very important, emulsions are meant for oral use. We also can have emulsions for external use, but categorically they are termed as creams, which we will be taking up later. So our discussion will be confined to the biphasic liquid systems meant for oral use emulsions. So one has to start defining emulsions by quoting that they are biphasic liquid dosage forms meant for oral use. The definition continues that they are thermodynamically unstable heterogeneous biphasic systems. So why they are thermodynamically unstable? Because they are 2-phase systems, and it is very important to understand with emulsions that although it has two phase systems, the one phase has to be a liquid which is immiscible in the other. Classical example is water and oil. It is a well known fact that water and oil are not miscible. So if the active pharmaceutical ingredient to be administered to a patient is an oil, for example, if one has to administer liquid paraffin to a patient, mainly for its purgative action, it would be very difficult for the patient to drink bland oil. So for that reason, a delivery system called emulsion can be thought about, and the API, which is here liquid paraffin, can be formulated into an emulsion. So basically it has to be understood that they are thermodynamically unstable, heterogeneous biphasic systems. Since it has two phases, one phase is going to be distributed into the other phase. So it is very important to understand that the one phase which is going to be distributed can also be called as internal phase or the disperse phase, whereas the other phase in which the first phase is going to be dispersed can be called as external phase or the dispersion medium. So there are various synonymous terms to understand the internal phase and external phase. Internal phase is nothing but the disperse phase, and also it is the discontinuous phase. So terminology will be either one can use as the internal phase, disperse phase, or the discontinuous phase. All means the same, that is the phase which is distributed into the other. On the contrary, the external phase can also be called as dispersion medium, or it can also be called as continuous phase. So because it is larger in volume, it is in continuity, it is called as continuous phase. So one has to be very clear that two phase systems, one is distributed into the other, one being distributed into the other with the help of a third ingredient which we call it as an emulsifying agent. So very importantly in definition, one has to mention that the liquid system which is temporarily getting distributed into each other has to be made stable by the presence of an emulsifying agent. Now generally the technique used for methodology in the preparation will use certain mechanical energy wherein the liquid which is getting distributed into the other phase will be of a particular size or a diameter. Generally the particle size of the internal phase or the dispersed phase will range between 0.1 micrometer to 100 micrometer. So just to summarize the definition, one can predict or one can mention the definition as emulsions are biphasic liquid dosage forms meant for oral use wherein they are thermodynamically unstable, having two phases, one being immiscible in the other and one phase being distributed as fine globules into the other, stabilized by the presence of an emulsifying agent, and the diameter of the particle of the dispersed phase ranging between 0.1 micrometer to 100 micrometer. So one quotes this definition, it becomes accomplished in its entire sense. Having understood the definition, next we need to understand how emulsions are classified. Emulsion systems are classified into different types based on different categories. Before entering into the classification, it is also wise to mention what are the basic merits of emulsion dosage form. The first and foremost, all the merits what we have touched with respect to liquid dosage form would apply here. In addition, this becomes a very important dosage form, especially when one has to administer a liquid drug which is generally oily in nature. So emulsions can be thought about or formulation can be undertaken in case a liquid drug has to be administered orally in a patient. So having understood the various merits, but at the same time the disadvantages of this system is its stability. So that we will be touching in the end of this series lecture with respect to the stability issues and also the methods to handle the stability issues. So having understood this background, we will get into what is the different ways by which an emulsion system can be classified. Emulsions can be classified based on different categories. One way of classification is going with orientation of phases. Second categorization for classification will be based on droplet size. Third technique for classification can be on the basis of physical state. And finally, an emulsion system can also be classified based on route of administration. As already I mentioned that we are talking emulsion exclusively when it is with pertinent to oral administration. So having understood the different ways of classifying, we will discuss each type of classification in detail. The first type of classification being based on orientation of phases. Now orientation of phases is having subcategorization either into simple type or multiple type. If we are aiming for system which is simply having both the phases or simple orientation, we subdivide the emulsions either into two types, oil in water type or water in oil type. Now how do one understand what is oil in water or water in oil type? It is very simple to understand that if the emulsion is oil in water type, it means oil becomes the disperse phase and water is the dispersion medium. On the contrary, if one refers to water in oil type, it is vice versa, where water is the disperse phase and oil becomes the continuous phase. So as already mentioned in the definition, two phases, one is going to be distributed into the other. If the numerator is oil, then oil is dispersed into water, and if water is in the numerator, it is vice versa. So simple emulsions can either be oil in water type or water in oil type. We can go one step forward wherein we have multiple type of emulsions. Now multiple type of emulsions can also be categorized into water in oil in water. So that's why they are called as multiple emulsions, though they are biphasic. So in simple type we have two phases, either one is dispersed into the other, whereas in multiple types we will have more than two layers or two phases. It is referred as water in oil in water and other side oil in water in oil. So to understand oil in water, I already mentioned that oil droplets are dispersed in continuous phase, which is water or aqueous phase. Similarly, to understand what is water in oil type, here oil phase will become the continuous phase and water droplet will behave as the internal phase or the disperse phase. Now when we talk in context to understand what are multiple emulsions, one has to remember very critically that we have understood oil in water. Now here there is three phase. So here whichever comes in the center, whichever phase comes in the center, that water droplets, for example in the first case oil on water on oil. So here the water droplets out of water in oil type emulsion will enclose small oil droplets as the internal phase. So here one has to understand that water droplets of the water in oil. So here basically you have first water in oil type of emulsion where water is the disperse phase and oil is the continuous phase, and inside that water droplets some of the oil droplets will get incorporated. So it becomes multiple phase, though they are biphasic, but we refer them as multiple emulsions because the oil is getting into the disperse phase which is in the dispersion medium. Similarly, on the same lines we will understand what is water in oil in water. So here the water droplets are going to be enclosed in the internal phase of the oil, which is in turn dispersed in the external phase which is water. So it is to be understood very critically that multiple emulsions are also categorized under biphasic. Otherwise a doubt would arise why multiple phase systems are brought under biphasic systems, wherein biphasic exclusively refers to two phase systems. So for that reason we categorize based on orientation of phases into simple type and multiple emulsions. Having understood the first type of classification, the second methodology for having to understand or to understand second type of classification is based on droplet size. So in the definition it was mentioned that one phase is getting distributed as fine globules or fine droplets into the other phase. So when we are talking about distribution of one phase as fine droplets, the size of the droplet or the globule becomes important. Based on the size of the droplet of the internal phase, we can categorize emulsions into either microemulsions or into macroemulsions. Macroemulsions can be again further subdivided into fine microemulsions or colloidal macroemulsions. So let's understand these terms in detail. So when we talk about the first type of classification based on droplet size, which is nothing but microemulsion. Now microemulsion is also referred as micellar emulsion. Now here the globule diameter or the globule size of the internal phase is going to be very small. So generally the size range is between 10 to 200 nanometer. We have one more terminology under microemulsion. If we reduce the particle size, we can call them as nanoemulsions. It is to be mentioned here that emulsion is a very conventional terminology for biphasic liquid dosage form. But when we talk about novel drug delivery systems, because there were some challenges with the conventional type of dosage forms, the technology advanced and novel drug delivery systems have been worked upon and are in preparation. So the extension of conventional emulsion dosage form in today's time is talking about novel drug delivery system wherein research work is on microemulsion techniques and as well as on nanoemulsion techniques. Now generally when we talk about microemulsions, they are most preferred type because they appear as clear as transparent solution. So patient acceptability becomes very better, and at the same time the particle diameter makes it convenient for administering not only orally but also by different routes of administration. The other advantage which one can mention with respect to this small particle size is when it is getting into the systemic circulation, it will affect the bioavailability. So also sometimes these strategies can be used for enhancement of bioavailability. So as we already know that majority of drugs which are formulated belong to BCS classification 2. So this is from research perspective point, the discussion which I am talking on. So if it is to be developed on research grounds, one should understand that if it is a poorly soluble drug and it is falling in BCS class 2, the technique of nanoemulsion or microemulsions can be taught about enhancing the bioavailability aspect when needed. Talking about the second type based on droplet size classification, we have macroemulsion. So the word itself is very self-explanatory, micro and macro. So micro was 10 to 200 nanometer. Here basically it is with regard to the particle size. But since macroemulsions is subcategorized into fine emulsions and also into coarse or colloidal emulsions, we need to understand very clearly the range of particle size which will categorize them into fine or coarse. Reference to fine emulsions, the mean globule diameter generally will fall between 0.1 micrometer to 5 micrometer. So please note here it is in micrometer scale, whereas in microemulsion we quoted nanometer scale. So definitely macroemulsion particle size is comparatively bigger compared to microemulsions. Similarly, on the lines of particle diameter, if we have to understand what are coarse or colloidal emulsions, here the globule size of the dispersed phase is going to be much bigger than 5 micrometer and it will be within 100 micrometer. So in this context, we call them as colloidal emulsions, or in general simple term is colloids. They are also referred as coarse emulsions or macro emulsions. Because of the difference of the particle size, Macro emulsions are generally milky in appearance as compared to micro emulsions, which are transparent in nature. Now here the scientific reasoning why micro emulsions are transparent and why macro emulsions are milky. It is because of scattering of light. When light falls on the interface, the particles scatter the light, and for that reason macro emulsions appear milky in appearance. Talking about the next strategy of classification is based on physical state. So whenever we want to understand the physical state, it is very clear that generally these are categorized under liquid dosage forms. So undoubtedly it should come under liquids. But emulsion type of formulations can also be devised into semi-solid type. So if the preparation is liquid in liquid, whether it is to be used orally or externally, this categorization is decided. So undoubtedly there are two liquid phases, and if the liquid in liquid phase is to be taken orally, we bring it under liquid type, wherein we are talking of emulsions. And if we are talking about physical state liquid in liquid and we are intending it for external use, then we categorize them under semi-solids, which are nothing but creams. Thank you.